A tech company offered $89 million for a broken espresso machine that cost $57 to own, and the man who bought it had no idea what he was standing on. It happened on October 14th at 9:04 in the morning on East 3rd Street in Marion, Indiana, inside a foreclosed strip mall nobody drove past twice anymore. 23 people packed into that room, every one of them there for the walk-in freezers next door. Nobody wanted the cafe. Ruth's Corner had been shut for 11 years, dust on the counters, cracked tiles down the middle of the floor, a dead espresso machine still sitting exactly where it died over a decade ago, like the whole building had just stopped breathing one day and nobody had come back to check. Dax Colby stood near the door, phone already up, filming for his auction channel. $50 says nobody even raises a hand for this dump. Earl Kessner raised his hand. The room laughed. $57. Gavel down. Bolted under the back counter, behind a loose panel nobody had touched in 11 years, was a second electrical box, steel, old, stamped with a code that matched nothing on file with the city. The code started with the letter G. Marcus Teal saw it first, not the box, the man. 17 years old, hauling crates for the auction house since spring, he watched Earl sign the paperwork. Earl didn't look surprised. He looked like a man finally allowed to open a door he'd been standing in front of for 11 years. Earl drove home, 2 miles, said nothing to his daughter, said nothing to the neighbor who asked why he wanted a burned-out cafe that had sat empty before her youngest was born. He believed he had 4 days before the city sent an inspector to walk the property. He was wrong. 72 hours later, a black SUV with a rental plate would stop outside Ruth's Corner at 6:40 in the morning. A woman named Renata Fields would step out holding a folder with Earl Kessner's name already printed on the cover. Earl had told no one what was behind that panel. He had 3 days left. He didn't know it yet. To understand why Earl Kessner didn't flinch when the room laughed at him, you have to understand what the last 11 years of his life had actually looked like. Earl worked the line at a diner called Pete's Griddle, 4 blocks from where Ruth's Corner sat boarded up and forgotten. 6 mornings a week he was at the flat top by 5:15, cracking eggs and flipping hash browns for a town that mostly didn't know his last name. He'd worked there since he was 57 years old. He was 68 now. Before Pete's Griddle, Earl had run his own cafe, not Ruth's Corner, a different cafe 2 towns over, back when Carol was still alive and his daughter Denise was still in high school. He'd built that business from nothing, 7 days a week for 19 years, and then Carol got sick, and the medical bills did what medical bills do to a small business with no cushion behind it. He sold the cafe for less than he owed it on. He never opened another one. Denise was 39 now, living 40 minutes away in Kokomo with 2 kids of her own. She called her father every Sunday at 6, and every Sunday Earl told her the same thing. He was fine, the knee was fine. No, he didn't need her to drive out, save the gas money for the kids. He never told her he'd started skipping his blood pressure medication some months to make sure her boys' birthday checks didn't bounce. Nobody at Pete's Griddle knew any of that. To the morning regulars, Earl was just the quiet cook who remembered how you liked your eggs without you ever having to say it twice. He didn't talk about the cafe he used to own. He didn't talk about Carol. He didn't talk about the fact that he still, 11 years later, drove past the boarded-up building on East 3rd Street most mornings on his way to work a job that wasn't his. He just clocked in, did the work right, and went home. The owner of Pete's Griddle, a hefty-weight, tired man named Gary Aldis, liked Earl fine, but had never once considered him for anything more than the line. "Earl's solid," Gary told a supplier once, "but he's not exactly going anywhere." He didn't mean it cruelly. He just meant what most of Marion, Indiana meant when they thought about Earl Kessner at all, which wasn't often. A good cook, reliable, nothing more expected of him and nothing more asked. Earl never corrected anybody. He'd learned a long time ago that explaining yourself to people who've already made their minds costs more than it's worth. What almost nobody remembered, what only a handful of old-timers in Marion could have told you if you'd thought to ask, was that before Earl ran his own cafe 2 towns over, before Carol, before any of it, Earl Kessner had spent 6 years as a young man working commercial electrical installation for a company that no longer existed. A company that had, for a brief stretch in the late 1970s, wired up something federal on the edge of town, back when Marion still had a small radar relay station nobody talked about anymore. Earl had never mentioned it at Pete's Griddle, not once in 11 years. He was about to need it.
Earl went back to Ruth's Corner that same afternoon he bought it, before the light was gone. He didn't bring a truck. He didn't bring tools, not yet. He brought a flashlight from his glove box and the key the auctioneer had handed him in a manila envelope, and he let himself into a building that had been sealed for 11 years. The smell hit him first, dust and stale grease, and something underneath it, faint like ozone. Earl stood just inside the door a long moment, the way he used to stand at the edge of a job site before he ever picked up a tool, just looking, just letting a place tell him what it was before he touched anything. The espresso machine sat exactly where the last owner had left it. Coffee cups still stacked on a shelf behind the counter, gone gray with dust. Earl walked past all of it to the back, to the panel Marcus Teal had watched him find that morning. He crouched down, popped the loose cover with 2 fingers, and shone the flashlight inside. It wasn't wired like a cafe. That was the first thing Earl noticed, and it was the thing nobody else in that auction room would have known to look for. A cafe panel runs lines to a fryer, a walk-in, maybe a water heater. This one had 6 heavy-gauge lines running out the back of the box into the wall, thick as Earl's thumb, feeding somewhere the cafe's floor plan didn't account for. And stamped into the steel cover in old block lettering, worn but legible if you knew to look close, was a code, G7714R. Earl had seen that exact numbering format one time in his life. 1979, working for a contractor called Vandry Electric, wiring a relay building on what was then the edge of town, out past the old airfield. The Marion Radar Relay Station, decommissioned in 1984. Earl was 21 years old, one of 6 men on that crew, sworn to a confidentiality form he'd signed and never thought about again for 42 years. The G prefix was theirs, government contractor coding, not municipal, not commercial. It had no business being bolted under the back counter of a cafe 4 blocks from Pete's Griddle. Earl sat back on his heels and looked at that panel a long time. He thought about calling the city the next morning, the way any reasonable man would, and having somebody official come look at it. He thought about it seriously. Then he thought about what happened 42 years ago, the one time a man on that same crew had asked too many questions about where those lines actually went. A man named Roy Ferris, who'd been let go within the week and never worked another job in that county again. Earl closed the panel cover. He didn't call anybody. He drove home, sat at his kitchen table until 11 that night, and tried to remember everything he could about a job he'd spent 40 decades trying to not think about. Wednesday morning, Earl went to work at Pete's Griddle like always. Cracked eggs, flipped hash browns, told a regular named Sal his usual was coming right up. Nobody looking at him across that counter would have guessed he'd spent half the previous night hunched over a kitchen table with a legal pad, trying to draw a wiring schematic from memory that was older than most of his customers. On his break, he called the county building department. He didn't mention the panel. He just asked, careful and vague, whether there'd ever been any federal utility work done along East 3rd Street back in the late 70s or early 80s. The woman who answered, a clerk named Donna Ray, laughed a little, not unkindly. "Mr. Kessner, that whole stretch has been zoned commercial before I was born. There's nothing federal out there. You're probably thinking of the old airfield, and that's 2 miles out." Earl thanked her and hung up. He tried once more later that day with an old acquaintance from his electrical days, a man named Purcell Ivy, who'd worked a different crew for Vandry back in the 70s and still lived in town. Purcell was 74 now, hard of hearing, happy for the company.
Vandry's been gone 30 years, Earl. Company folded, records folded with it. Whatever you think you saw, there's nobody left who'd know different than you do right now. Purcell laughed, the same easy laugh Donna Ray had used. You're an old man chasing an old memory. Could be your mind's just playing at something that never was. Earl didn't argue with him. He never argued with anybody. He just said maybe Purcell was right, thanked him for his time, and hung up the phone. But that night, back at Ruth's corner with a headlamp and a socket set, Earl pulled the whole panel cover off, and behind it, screwed into the wall stud, he found a second, smaller plate, aluminum, not steel, riveted on, easy to miss unless you were looking exactly where Earl was looking. Stamped on it, Property of U.S. Gov. Do not remove. G7714R. Below that, in a hand-stamped serial line worn almost illegible, a partial word survived. 6 letters. G-R-A-C-E. Earl sat back on the cold floor of that dead cafe and stared at the word Grace a long time. Everybody he'd asked had told him, one way or another, that there was nothing there. The clerk, Purcell, his own good sense some nights telling him he was an old man wasting a week on a mystery that would turn out to be nothing at all. And every single one of them was wrong, and Earl was starting to understand just how wrong. He had 2 days left before the inspector's visit he still believed was coming. He had no idea that a black SUV was already on its way. Earl didn't sleep much that week. He went to work, he came home, and every evening he drove the 2 miles to Ruth's corner and sat with that aluminum plate under his flashlight, turning the word Grace over in his head the way he used to turn a stubborn wire connection, looking for the one thing that would make the rest make sense. He remembered pieces now. Not everything. 42 years doesn't give a man everything back at once, but pieces, coming loose like rust finally lets go of a shackle. He remembered the relay station had 2 structures, not one. A main building everybody on the crew worked, and a second, smaller outbuilding set off behind it that only 2 men were ever allowed near. Earl wasn't one of the 2. He'd only run conduit toward it, 6 lines thick as his thumb, and been told by the site supervisor, a clipped, humorless man named Byron Coates, that where those lines actually terminated was not part of your job, son. Earl let it go at 21 years old because a paycheck mattered more than a question. He was seeing now, at 68, sitting on the cold floor of a dead cafe, that the 6 lines he'd run in 1979 hadn't ended at the relay station at all. They'd been rerouted at some point, buried, and brought 4 blocks into town, into a building that in 1979 hadn't even existed yet as a cafe. Which meant somebody, after the relay station was decommissioned in 1984, had gone to real trouble and real expense to keep those lines live and keep them hidden, and built a cafe over the top of the splice like a lid on a box. Earl thought about Roy Ferris again, the man who asked one question too many in 1979 and never worked in that county again. He wondered, for the first time in over 42 years, whether Roy actually just got fired. He didn't call the city. He didn't call Purcell again. He didn't call his daughter, though he almost did twice, and both times set the phone back down. Instead, on Thursday night, he did the only thing that had ever made sense to him his whole life when something was locked and nobody would give him a straight answer. He got out his old multimeter, the one he still kept in a drawer from his electrical days, and he tested the panel. The lines were live. 11 years empty, no account on file with the utility company, no permit, no owner of record paying a bill on it, and the lines behind that panel were carrying current. Earl sat back against the counter and looked at the dark ceiling of Ruth's corner for a long time. Whatever Grace was, somebody, somewhere, was still paying to keep it running. He had 1 day left before he expected the city inspector.
He had no idea that at that same hour, 3 states away, a woman named Renata Fields was already boarding a flight, holding a folder with his name on it and a satellite photo of a building he'd bought for $57.
Friday morning, 6:40 a.m. Earl was already at Ruth's Corner before his shift at Pete's Griddle, standing at the counter with a cup of gas station coffee when the black SUV pulled up outside. He watched it park through the front window. Rental plate, Illinois. A woman got out, alone, mid-40s, dark blazer, a leather folder tucked under one arm like she'd done this exact walk 100 times before. She didn't look at the building the way most people looked at Ruth's Corner. She looked at it the way Earl looked at a lock before he touched it. She knocked. Earl let her in. "Mr. Kestner, my name is Renata Fields. I work in infrastructure acquisitions." She said it plainly, no smile built into it, the kind of voice that had already decided how the conversation was going to go before it started. "I'll get straight to it. My company has an interest in this property and in something underneath it." Earl didn't answer right away. He'd spent 42 years learning that the man who talks first in a negotiation is usually the man who loses it. "Which company?" he said finally. "Halloran Systems." She let that sit a second, the way you'd let a name land if you expected it to mean something. It didn't, not to Earl, not yet. "We maintain a small number of legacy relay assets across the Midwest, most of them decommissioned decades ago. One of them was never fully decommissioned. It was rerouted." She glanced toward the back counter, toward the panel Earl had spent 4 nights taking apart by hand. "You found it." "I found a code that starts with a G," Earl said. "Nobody could tell me what it was attached to." "It's attached to a fiber and power trunk that 3 regional data providers still lease bandwidth through, Mr. Kestner, quietly. For 31 years, that splice has sat under what became, at various points, a hardware store, a laundromat, and a cafe. And every owner of this address for 3 decades has been paid, off the books, a small annual maintenance fee to leave the panel alone and ask no questions." She opened the folder. "The fee was paid to an estate account for 11 years, ever since the last cafe owner passed away with no listed next kin. When the county finally cleared the property for auction, that account had no one left to redirect the payment to." Earl looked at her a long moment. "So the money's been sitting there, waiting on whoever bought a $57 building nobody wanted." "Yes, and as of Tuesday afternoon, Mr. Kestner, that's you." She didn't say the number yet. She wanted to see what Earl did with silence first. Earl just nodded slowly, the way a man nods when a lock he's been listening to for 4 days finally told him exactly what it was asking the whole time. "You didn't fly out here for a maintenance fee," he said finally. Renata Fields closed the folder halfway. A corner of an offer letter showed at the edge of it, a number too long to read upside down. "No," she said, "I flew out here because my company would like to buy this building outright, Mr. Kestner, today if possible." Renata Fields set the folder flat on the dusty counter and turned it so Earl could read it right side up. $89 million. Earl looked at the number a long time. He didn't reach for the folder. He didn't say anything for almost a full minute, and Renata Fields, to her credit, let him have the silence instead of filling it the way most people would. "You didn't fly out here for a taffé," Earl said finally. "No," Renata said, "it's not." She told him the rest of it straight, the way Earl had noticed she told everything, no dressing it up, no talking around the hard parts. Halloran Systems had bought up the old relay contracts 11 years ago in a routine acquisition, mostly for patents and equipment nobody expected to matter again. Buried in the paperwork of that acquisition was a single decommissioned line item, Marion Relay Auxiliary, Unit G7714R, status unresolved. For 11 years, nobody at Halloran had looked twice at it.
The maintenance fee kept getting paid automatically out of a legacy escrow account. The splice kept carrying quiet backup bandwidth for 3 regional carriers who didn't know or ask where their redundancy actually lived, and everybody assumed somebody else was minding it.
Then, 6 weeks ago, one of those 3 carriers had a major outage 2 states over. Their engineers traced their backup failover, expecting nothing, and found 42-year-old copper and fiber still live under a boarded-up cafe in Marion, Indiana, carrying more redundant load than anyone had documented anywhere. Once we found it, Renata said, we needed the property. Clean, no liens, no confusion, no chance of some new owner deciding to renovate and taking a sledgehammer to a wall that's holding up infrastructure 3 companies are quietly depending on. We tried to buy it before the auction. The estate attorney wouldn't return calls. Then the county auctioned it before we could stop it, and a man we'd never heard of bought it for $57 while our regional team was still on hold with the county clerk's office. Earl almost smiled at that. Almost. So you're not here about a cafe. You're here because I could tear a wall out this weekend and cost your company more than the $89 million you're offering me. That's a fair way to put it, Renata said. Here was the part that Earl turned over slowly in his mind, standing in that dead cafe with a fortune folded flat on the counter in front of him. Everyone who had laughed at him in that auction room, Dax Colby loudest of all, had been laughing at a man who supposedly didn't understand what he was buying. Earl had bought it because for 4 straight nights he was the only person in the entire county willing to sit on a cold floor with a flashlight and actually listen to what that panel was trying to tell him. He looked at Renata Fields. "Before I sign anything," Earl said, "I want to know what happened to a man named Roy Ferris in 1979, and I want it in writing that whatever you people bury under buildings in this town from here on, somebody tells the next owner the truth before they hand him a padlock and a joke." Renata Fields didn't answer that right away. She closed her folder, sat down on an overturned crate across from Earl, the only 2 pieces of furniture left in that dead cafe, and for the first time since she'd walked in, she sounded less like a company and more like a person. "I don't know who Roy Ferris is, Mr. Kestner. I'm telling you that honestly, but I can find out. Give me a week." It took 4 days, not 1. What came back, through channels Earl never asked to see and Renata never fully explained, was a single paragraph pulled from an old contractor's personnel file, water-damaged, barely scanned. Roy Ferris, terminated August 1979. Cause listed as unauthorized inquiry into restricted work scope. No severance, no reference. Vandry Electric folded 6 years later, and whatever else the file might have said had gone with it. Earl asked Renata to find out if Roy Ferris was still alive. He was, 86 years old, living in an assisted care facility 2 counties over, a man nobody from his old crew had spoken to in decades. Earl drove out to see him himself on a Sunday before he'd signed a single piece of paper from Halloran Systems. Roy Ferris didn't remember much anymore, but he remembered getting fired. He remembered driving home that day at 29 years old with 3 kids and no job and telling his wife he must have done something wrong, though he never could say what. He carried that not knowing for 42 years, the quiet kind of shame a man carries when the world lets him believe something about himself that isn't true and never corrects it. Earl sat with him a long time and told him plainly he hadn't done anything wrong. He'd asked a fair question, and the company he worked for had been ashamed of the answer, not of him.
Roy Ferris cried in that visiting room. An old man finally handed back 42 years he didn't know he'd been missing. Word moved through Marion the way it always does in a small town, slow at first and then everywhere at once. It wasn't Earl who told it, it was Marcus Teal, who'd never stopped wondering about the tired look on Earl's face the day of the auction, and who'd been the one Earl finally sat down with and explained the whole thing to, start to finish, the way you'd explain something to somebody who'd earned the right to hear it plainly. People who'd laughed at Ruth's corner came by different now, Not to see the building, but to see Earl. Sal from the diner, Donna Ray from the county office, a little sheepish, even Gary Aldis, who found himself, a few weeks later, telling a supplier without quite meaning to, Earl's sharper than any of us ever gave him credit for. Dax Colby heard about it same as everyone else, secondhand, through a picture of the sale that made the local paper. He didn't come by. He'd already moved 2 towns over by then, his auction channel quieter than it used to be, still chasing the next fast flip, still laughing loud at the next slow man he didn't understand. Earl signed with Halloran Systems on a Thursday. $89 million, less legal fees, less the amount he insisted go first to Roy Ferris and his family, a number Earl never told anyone in town and never asked for thanks for. Earl didn't buy a new truck. He didn't move out of the small house on Willow Street he'd lived in since Carol died. What he did the week after the money cleared was drive to Kokomo on a Sunday afternoon instead of waiting for his daughter's usual 6 o'clock call. Denise opened the door and knew something was different before Earl said a word. He'd never once in 11 years shown up unannounced. He sat at her kitchen table, the same way he used to sit at his own, and told her everything. The auction, the panel, the 4 cold nights with a flashlight, Roy Ferris crying in a visiting room 2 counties over, and the number that still didn't feel real to him, even with his name on the wire transfer. Denise cried too, though for a different reason. She told her father she'd spent 11 years worrying quietly that he was too proud to ask for help if he ever needed it, and it had never once occurred to her that the thing he actually needed help with was believing he still mattered to anybody outside a diner kitchen. Earl paid off her mortgage that year, quietly, the way he did everything. He set money aside for both his grandsons, released to them on their 18th birthdays, no ceremony attached to it. He kept working the line at Pete's Griddle 2 more months, finishing out his notice properly, the way he'd always finished things properly, and Gary Aldis never did figure out how to say goodbye to a cook who'd turned out to be worth $89 million. Ruth's Corner is gone now. Halloran Systems took the building down carefully, board by board, the splice rerouted properly this time, documented this time, no lid quietly bolted over a secret for the next unlucky owner to inherit. In its place is a small fenced lot with a maintenance shed on it, and nobody in Marion much notices it anymore, which is exactly how infrastructure like that is supposed to sit. But at the County Historical Society, if you ask the right person, they'll show you a short write-up in a folder, Roy Ferris's story and Earl's filed together, the record finally set straight for both of them. Earl still stops by Pete's Griddle sometimes, not to work, just for coffee. He sits at the counter same as any regular, and if you didn't know his name, you'd never guess what he was worth, or what he'd found, or how many years he'd spent quietly not being believed by people who'd already decided who he was. So here's what I keep coming back to every time I tell a story like this one. Somewhere near you right now, there's probably a person everyone's already decided isn't worth a second look. A quiet one, a slow one, someone who gets laughed at for paying attention to a thing everybody else walked past. Next time that happens in front of you, I want you to ask yourself the same question Earl Kestner never had to ask himself because he already knew the answer. Are you looking at the rust and the broken lock and the $57? Or are you looking at the one thing worth patiently listening to long after everyone else has stopped? If this story kept you here till the end, you already know what to do. Subscribe and tell me in the comments who's the quiet one in your life that nobody's given credit to yet. I read every single one.